So we'll make this available on our Blackboard course. And if anybody wants to have the link to the recording, please just let us know. So welcome everybody to Graduate School's Lunchtime Seminars. Today we have got Dr. Jesvir Mahil with us from Aston Business School. Jesvir works as a coach on the Senior Leader Master's Degree Apprenticeship Program. And her research specializes in research into value-based leadership, creativity, and culture. And today she kindly accepted our invite to come and talk to us about the use of public engagement for influence and impact of research. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jesvir.
Thank you very much, Erin. Thank you for the introduction, and hello everyone. I met Erin about 5 years ago through my public engagement activities when we were both working at the other university, at the University of Birmingham. So it was a very pleasant surprise to find that many years later, our paths have crossed again, and we're still involved in public engagement activities. This is an example of how public engagement works. The impact is not always immediate. It's rarely a direct cause and effect linear relationship. The impact is often surprising and experienced in the long term rather than in the short term. My overall aim today is to highlight that public is very personal and that a deep level of engagement between our personal public can help us to fulfill deep-seated childhood dreams long after we may have given up on them. In the spirit of public engagement, I'm positioning myself not as an expert, but someone who is enthusiastically learning how to use this process most effectively. I'm using a social scientist paradigm in advocating that research should be available, accessible, and beneficial to all. And I accept that in some research disciplines, these values are not top priorities. Public engagement is something that all of us have experienced in some shape or form. So at regular intervals, I'll be inviting you to use the chat box to type in your response to my questions. And Erin will let me know a couple of those comments, time allowing, and we will have a fuller discussion based on your comments at the end of the presentation. I'll take your questions at the end. The underlying concept through this presentation is that public is personal. How is the public personal? Well, let me start with an example of how I've used public engagement to fulfill a childhood dream that I thought was impossible. My family have lived in Stafford, which is about 25 miles north of Birmingham, since the late 1950s. Over the past 70 years, we've established a thriving community, and to celebrate the success and pioneering spirit of our Sikh elders, I wrote a book called Sikhs of Stafford. This book is based on research that relied solely on my public engagement activities within my community. My family, like most of the others in the Sikh community in Stafford, were farmers and landowners in the Punjab. To settle in a foreign country, they took on very hard, low-paid, unrewarding manual labour in factories. They raised their children to do well in education so they could have a better standard of living by becoming professionals. As a child, growing up in Stafford, my driving dream and aspiration was to become a doctor, a medical doctor. But I didn't get the grades I needed for medical school, so I studied psychology instead and became a teacher. Eventually, after many decades of teaching, I successfully completed my PhD in education, and I earned myself the title doctor. I thought this was a very creative way of fulfilling my childhood dream of being a medical doctor. Instead of helping people with their physical ailments, I was now more concerned with their standards of living and their well-being through higher education. In this respect, my PhD was very important to me. And it was also important to my community in Stafford because I was one of their first to reach this milestone. However, the highest levels of education without an impact in improving our standard of living can seem to be counterintuitive and counterproductive. Before my PhD, I was working in further education colleges and earning at least 10% more than I'm currently earning working in higher education with a PhD. We have to navigate barriers to our success creatively. So I shifted my focus to adding value to my community through public engagement activities. This cultivated a very deep level of trust and mutual respect. After I completed Sikhs of Stafford, amazing things began to happen. My network of professional Sikhs from around the world grew rapidly, and I'm often addressed as Dr. Sahibji, which, as you know, is a term of very deep respect and honor. My public engagement activities have not only expanded my sphere of influence in the public domain, they've also deepened my own childhood desires to serve my community through interventions which makes the quality of life a bit better for all of us. This is exactly what my parents made significant sacrifices to achieve. So when I'm addressed as Dr. Sahibji, it reminds me that even though I'm not a medical doctor, I am a doctor in education, and I can make a significant impact on raising the standards of living and well-being through education. By writing Sikhs of Stafford, I've demonstrated my values in the skills and my credibility. And this has led to 550 international Sikh professionals willing to support me in a huge leadership project which spans all continents. For each one of us, as educators or as researchers, we'll find our own personal aspirations and our own public impact in a manner that is both public and very personal. In academia, we have to begin with the question, well, when we're thinking about who is the public, what is our purpose? We need to determine the purpose for engaging with our public. This could be related to widening participation, knowledge transfer, entrepreneurialism, or consultancy, where research is conducted to resolve specific business-related problems. Public engagement may also be a strategy used for decolonization of the curriculum. We can use public engagement to make the curriculum more relevant and useful for a diverse range of beneficiaries. In a cosmopolitan city such as Birmingham, where almost half the population, like my own family, have a migrant heritage. In the West Midlands, many local communities are underrepresented in leadership and management roles. When we look at the curriculum for leadership and management, for example, our MBA programs, you may recognize the leading protagonists such as Porter, Drucker, Deming, Senge, Handy. These are some of my favorite authors, and they've obviously contributed a lot to contemporary literature. But I've been teaching their leadership and management theories for decades, and I notice the underlying links between education in leadership and representation of our local communities in senior leadership roles. The current lack of diversity in leadership roles, which in the West Midlands is undeniable, may be associated with lack of representation in leadership education. As researchers, we will all have our own purpose, our own motivation for using public engagement. My personal motivation, from a social scientist perspective, is related to a desire for social justice. The coronavirus pandemic has exposed the limitations of legislation such as equal opportunities in addressing inequalities in health and wealth. In my view, equal opportunities without the social and cultural capital that is required for success are unlikely to address inequalities and injustices effectively. Public engagement activities can be used to address this. We acquire social capital through networks for sharing knowledge, mentoring to refine our skills, and sponsorship that provides advocacy to support our success. Our cultural capital lies in our identity, our values, and our heritage. Without respect to social and cultural needs and expectations, we cannot expect equal opportunities legislation to reduce inequalities. The question, who is the public, is not only personal, it's also political, because it's about a choice we make. So who do we choose to be our public? As a researcher, this is one of the most important choices we make, as it will determine the shape of our findings, our influence, and the impact we make. Do we choose those with a familiar or unfamiliar identity? And there may be a time and a place for both. For example, in my current research for a book on leadership, I have chosen Sikhs, but for my research into creativity, most of the contributors are non-Sikhs. Which language and how many different languages can we accommodate? When I wrote Sikhs of Stafford, I used 2 languages, Punjabi and English. For my research into leadership and creativity, I use only English because I want to work with an international audience. Are we going to engage with a public that is literate or illiterate? For Sikhs of Stafford, I worked with both literate and illiterate contributors. However, for the book on leadership, I've chosen to work with only literate contributors because I want them to be able to read and respond to the articles I write. Is our public farmers, manual workers, or professionals? In my book, Sikhs of Stafford, I trace the transformation of my Sikh community coming to England from farming backgrounds, taking on manual work in factories, and raising their children to become professionals. In contrast, for my book on leadership, I'm only working with professionals in leadership positions. Our choice of public is often underpinned by shared values. However, our public may also include those with opposing values. Those who position themselves as our adversaries, they are also part of our public. For my research on leadership, I embrace contributors who have very different values and very different experiences to my own. The location of our public is important. For Sikhs of Stafford, I chose a local public. These are members of my community who've seen me grow up. They know my family history and they've shared times of sadness and celebrations with us. On the other hand, for my current research on leadership, most of the contributors are international and they came into my sphere of influence after I wrote Sikhs of Stafford, and they perceive me very differently to those I grew up with. They address me as Dr. Mahil Saab instead of simply by my first name, Jesvir. Using factors such as identity, values, and location, I chose my public to be 550 international Sikh professionals from my network on LinkedIn. Around 10% of my network on social media are Sikhs, roughly 500 out of a total network of 5,000 professional connections across different social media platforms. My aim is to expand my sphere of influence in education and research, where Sikhs are a highly educated but very underrepresented minority. As the size of our public grows, the extent of our influence and impact should deepen. Who is the public for you? As I said, the public is personal, it's also political. So I'll give you a minute just to type in your comments into the chat box, and I'll ask Erin just to share a couple of those comments. We'll have a fuller discussion about this at the end of the discussion, where I'll take any questions arising. But for now, if you could just type in your initial comments on who is the public, and as I say, I'll ask Erin to let me know a couple of your comments.
Right, we'll give people some time to type. So we've got one contribution: families, patients. Somebody from a healthcare background and stakeholders, government departments, businesses.
Okay, brilliant.
We've got more coming. In general, the society. In my research, it is the UK Parliament, health service providers, patients, pharmaceutical companies. And we've got more business community and at the local community.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, we'll take some more of these comments and any questions arising at the end. Now for the second question, what do we mean by engagement? First of all, engagement means that communication is multidirectional. It's not one-way communication. As researchers, we need to be willing to listen, to learn, and to adapt. We don't position ourselves as experts. Thirdly, we allow contributors to represent themselves. We avoid speaking on behalf of the contributors. We create opportunities for them to speak for themselves. Fourthly, research is done with rather than on the community. As I mentioned earlier, our public is personal, and who we choose to be our public can be a political choice. I choose to work with those who are normally marginalised, seeking to position them centrally rather than as outsiders. For example, in writing my current book on leadership, as I am also a Sikh, the Sikhs in my research are not positioned as the other. They've not been invited to contribute to the research because their behaviour styles are exotic, strange, or unfamiliar to me. In doing research with my public rather than about them, our collective voices become normalised rather than marginalised. Our behaviour patterns are interesting and inspiring rather than odd and exotic. Our insights are relevant and significant internationally rather than to a small local community. With a high level of engagement with our public, we can co-create knowledge. For example, I've written several articles in collaboration with those who've seen my conference speeches on the subject of creativity. I publish these on my websites and they're freely available to the public. Another example is a very high ratio of active versus passive participation at the online conferences I organise. Over the past 5 years, I've had up to 80 speakers with a total of 120 participants. In other words, 2/3 of the audience were actively speaking. They were actively engaged rather than passively engaged as speakers, as listeners. So now I'll give you a minute or two just to type into the chat box the answer to your question. How do you engage with your public in a way that is multi-directional? And I'll get Erin to let me know a couple of your comments, and we'll discuss these at the end.
So we've got somebody saying social media, online presence, for example, Twitter, conferences. We've got by writing articles, blogs, and comments, and speaking in radio, professional body outputs, and stakeholder workshops.
Okay, sounds very interesting. And yeah, we'll discuss these at the end.
And we've got more coming, so I think they're very interesting. So I'll add those as well. Writing to MPs, speaking on radio or TV, business networks, social media, local meetings. So great answers.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Erin. In developing public engagement activities as researchers, we need to ensure we're clear of our aims, objectives, and also the underpinning theories that advocate the use of public engagement. For example, our aim may be to empower those who are normally marginalised through providing opportunities for representation, making the research relevant and valuable. I do this by organising online conferences, which Erin, you just mentioned that some people are talking about using conferences as well. I do that a lot for sharing ideas and networking with other speakers. And this is supported by the philosophical theory of communicative action following the contemporary philosopher Habermas. When communication is sincere, truthful, and articulate, it generates power that can serve as a catalyst for change and transformation. To acknowledge the time, effort, and contributions of my public, I write research-based articles, and I share these regularly and frequently. This is supported by Cialdini's theories of influence. Reciprocity builds trust, and it encourages collaboration. Of course, there are many more theories than just these that support them, but I've just chosen one theory that I find particularly useful in supporting why I'm doing what I'm doing in terms of public engagement. To learn and to adapt my research with new ideas from my expanding network of contacts, I use an emergent model to continue to learn from and respond to an expanding network of contributors. This is based on systems thinking theories of emergence and complexity. Through the process of public engagement, we can expect surprises. As I mentioned earlier, in reference to Erin and I working in two different universities with two different cultures, very different priorities. We may need to adapt in response to both positive and negative feedback. So the three aims that I find most useful for my public engagement activities are, first of all, empowerment of those who may feel invisible, ignored, or marginalized. Secondly, reciprocity to encourage collaboration and co-creation of knowledge. And thirdly, adaptation in response to feedback. And how about you? What is your purpose and aims? So could you again, please type into the chat box and Erin will let us know your responses.
So we've got informing policy.
Mm-hmm.
Starting or participating in a debate. Effective interaction. And influence decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And provide support for the end user. And become famous. I like that. To engage with a wide range of people having experienced similar things and show that there is pattern rather than coincidence, and to give oral evidence to Parliament and be involved in public policy debate and be active in the political process and see what these patterns are. So that's in relation to seeing the patterns of behavior.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we've got get your research published and publicized. Brilliant.
Yeah, great. Yes, excellent. And quality can also improve the quality of our research, because we can get many different stakeholders to input their evaluations. Reflexivity, we could reflect on our own biases, our own positionality, our own context through public engagement. Praxis, we can transform outdated and challenged beliefs. Communication skills, because as we expand our network, we're constantly coming into contact with people that we wouldn't ordinarily have had conversations with. And through our discussions and through our debates with an expanding network, we can develop our communication skills. Impact, some of you have mentioned that applying the research to create innovative products, services, systems, policies. You've talked about having an influence, having an impact on decision making. Could also include publishing books, creating conferences, courses, becoming famous. Through your public engagement activities, you can become increasingly visible, credible, and influential. And maybe I should have added famous. So let's go on to the next question then. What are the benefits and risks of using social media for public engagement? Very often people talk about the benefits of using social media, or they talk about the risks of using social media, but not both. And I think there's always pros and cons. I tend to use LinkedIn the most. And the benefit of LinkedIn for me is that it's a list of professional and business contacts who are generally very supportive of my work, because otherwise they wouldn't be on my list. The disadvantage of LinkedIn is that it can be very time consuming, contacting everyone in the network individually and personally. Only 50 people can be mass emailed at any one time, and contacts don't like to receive a generic impersonal message that has obviously been sent to a lot of people. What have been your experiences of LinkedIn, both positive or negative? If you could just type it into the chat box, and Erin will speak out what you've said.
So we've got time consuming
yes,
as a limitation. And not wide reach. We've got a positive aspect of social media. Helps me have a CV blueprint of all the things I have done right there. And another person saying it has huge potential to engage with specific audiences.
Yes, that's right. Excellent. Thank you. So another platform that I use is Twitter, and I use Twitter to publicize my public engagement activities. And for me, the advantage of Twitter is diversity. Compared with LinkedIn, there's a lot more diversity for me in Twitter because I can attract unknown followers. The risk is the lack of control over where your message will end up. You may attract more of those who disagree with you than those who share your values, and this can be very draining emotionally. And if you could just type in what's been your experience of using Twitter, either positive or negative, if you could just type it into the chat box, please. And then Erin, if you could just read out a few of the comments.
Mm-hmm. So we just got some positive feedback, very inspiring talk, Jesvir. I think somebody needs to leave, but that's positive feedback. And we've got Twitter is definitely more useful for me coming from arts and humanities and linguistics.
Okay. All right, great. Brilliant.
And requires consistent efforts, but with good reach.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yes, there is potential for exponential reach.
We've got one more. Sarah saying, I agree, Twitter has been great for networking and actually finding research articles there before elsewhere, especially now with COVID and everything. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So YouTube is another one that I use, and I use this for my conferences and my post-conference activities. And the wide range of international contacts on YouTube can improve our credibility. And as someone said earlier, it can make us famous potentially in the long run. However, the risk is that thousands of comments may prove to be a distraction, and a lot of time can be wasted managing the comments. Has anybody else experienced the same, or different experiences on YouTube? If you could just type in your answers to chat.
While we're waiting, we've got one comment about the previous platform saying it makes it easier to also engage on a personal level with people whose reach you follow. But with YouTube, they're saying not yet experienced this.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, well, let's continue with some of the risks then of public engagement. You know, you've told us about the fact that it can be time consuming. You know, I agree with you that time can be wasted. It can be very distracting. There's also the issue of lack of control. Our ideas may be distorted, they may be misused, they may be misappropriated to support counter narratives to the one that you intend. And also there's a risk of ownership and copyright of ideas. These may be contested. Who owns the knowledge that was created in a conversation on social media? You know, maybe you asked a question and somebody else gave a response. Who owns that conversation where both parties were responsible for creating that conversation? One person may want to commercialize the knowledge, whereas another may not. You have to be prepared for the emergence of unpredictable, competitive initiatives. Some members of your public may be competing for self-interest rather than collaboration and public interest. Can anybody else think of any other risks there may be apart from these ones that we've already mentioned? I'll just give you a minute to type in your answers.
So the potential danger of being targeted by extremist groups, feminist research in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
And
making
serious mistakes in live TV or radio.
Yeah. Yes, it can be very, very draining and damaging when we make those mistakes because we, you know, haven't thought about what we're going to say. And I find that there can be additional risks to a loss of reputation and self-confidence when academics see our public engagement as popular journalism rather than scholarship, especially when we comment about academic topics that we don't have expertise in. So my recommendation would be, you know, if we're serious about public engagement, is to avoid commenting on things that we, you know, we're not experts in, because those comments can be used against us, and that negative feedback can be damaging in the long term. People have lost their jobs, they've lost career progression opportunities, they've lost friends due to careless public comments on social media. There was that high profile case about David Starkey last year, who lost his job at Cambridge University due to unacceptable comments about slavery. Now, moving on to the question that inspires me the most about public engagement. What is it that motivates our public to participate in our research? Over the years, I've noticed that my public is often motivated to contribute because of shared values that reflect my own as a researcher and educator. For example, there are those who are motivated by citizenship and a desire to contribute to public debate for the benefit of our community and society. Others are motivated by a desire to challenge the status quo so that inequities, imbalances of power, and the needs of marginalized groups can be addressed. The third type of participant in my public engagement, in any case, is interested in learning and creation of new knowledge, and they have a strong desire to learn new ways of thinking and behaving. Like myself, they want to pioneer fairer systems, fairer processes. As educators and researchers, we can all relate at least partially to values underpinning citizenship, activism, and the pursuit of knowledge with a desire to improve the quality of our lives. How can we use public engagement to make high quality research available, accessible, and beneficial to all? With a desire to address this concern, my research methodology has evolved over the years. Instead of participants, I now work with contributors, collaborators, and co-creators of knowledge through my research projects. Instead of conducting interviews, I create conversations and I record these as data. of course, with permission, with full transparency. Instead of organizing focus groups, I organize online conferences, which I also record as data, again, with permission. To make research available, accessible and beneficial to all, we need to overcome barriers such as finance, distance and time. I'm overcoming these barriers by using technology to organize online conversations, conferences, and sharing of knowledge through social media and my own websites. Now, how about yourselves? So at this point, we can actually take the questions live.